The Whitmore Motors plant had exactly 6 hours before the bank sent men with padlocks, and in those 6 hours a single father named Elias Rowan did what 10 engineers could not. He restarted the line, saved the contract, and kept 800 families from the edge of ruin. The next morning, CEO Arabella Whitmore offered no bonus, no handshake, no private word of thanks. She had him fired, kept his designs, and let a security guard walk him to the gate. Elias did not beg. He picked up his toolbox, made a quiet promise, and left with an idea powerful enough to make him the most dangerous competitor she would ever face. If you believe the person who was betrayed can still win on merit alone, stay with Elias until the very end. Belhaven, Ohio had once been the kind of city that appeared in regional magazines alongside words like industrial backbone and working-class pride. But by the time Elias Rowan had spent 16 years on the floor of Whitmore Industrial, the compliments had gone quiet, and the layoff notices had not. The plant covered 40 acres on the south side of town, employing close to 800 people across 3 shifts, manufacturing precision motors for power grids and the kind of heavy infrastructure that kept larger cities running without anyone thinking much about where the parts came from. Whitmore Industrial had been the founding company of Belhaven in the truest sense. The Whitmore family had built the first facility in the 1940s, expanded through the post-war boom, and survived 3 recessions through a combination of stubbornness and mechanical ingenuity that the current generation had not entirely inherited. By the time Arabella Whitmore took the reins from her father, the company was carrying a debt load north of $1 billion, had lost its 2 largest contracts in as many years, and was hemorrhaging talent to larger manufacturers in the region who could offer better wages and more predictable hours. The plant floor itself told the story more honestly than any earnings report. Machines that should have been replaced a decade ago were being held together by the judgment of men like Elias, who had learned over years that the right sound from a motor meant more than any diagnostic readout. The contract that was supposed to save Whitmore Industrial arrived in the form of a $180 million order for precision industrial motors, a deal that required the company to deliver a successful prototype run within a tightly defined window before full production would be authorized. Elias knew the specifications better than anyone else on the floor, having spent nights at his workbench studying the tolerance requirements and mentally mapping which machines could handle the load and which would need to be nursed through the run. He had submitted 3 written proposals to Conrad Blackwell, the chief operating officer, suggesting targeted upgrades to the primary drive assembly that would increase throughput by nearly 30% without requiring new equipment purchases. Conrad had acknowledged none of them, and the proposals had gone nowhere. On the night the prototype run was scheduled to begin, a Tuesday in February, when the temperature outside had dropped well below freezing, the primary press line went silent at 11 minutes past 9, with a grinding shudder that every experienced worker on the floor immediately recognized as something more serious than a routine fault. The engineering team dispatched from Chicago examined the drive unit for 2 hours and delivered a verdict. The transmission assembly had failed completely, and replacement would take a minimum of 6 weeks. The customer's deadline was 6 hours away. Conrad Blackwell walked into the situation with the calm of a man who had already prepared for it, suggesting that Whitmore declare a force majeure event, halt the prototype run, and open negotiations with Ashbourne Equity, a private investment fund that had been circling the company for months, offering to absorb its debt in exchange for a controlling stake. The implication was clear to anyone paying attention. Ashbourne would buy the company's assets at a distressed price, close the unprofitable facilities, and relocate production to lower-cost markets. 800 jobs would not survive that transition. Elias was not in the room when Conrad made the proposal, but he was standing close enough to the press line to hear the machine differently from how the engineers had described it. The drive unit was not the source of the failure, he was certain of that. The sound that had preceded the shutdown pointed to harmonic interference between three aging control modules, a problem that could in theory be resolved without replacing anything at all. He walked to the shift supervisor's station and requested permission to examine the control cabinet. Conrad, made aware of the request within minutes, appeared beside him and said flatly that Elias had no engineering credentials authorizing him to touch the equipment, and that any unauthorized interference would result in immediate termination. Arabella Whitmore arrived at the plant at 11:40, dressed in the kind of clothing that suggested she had been pulled from a dinner rather than a bed, and she stood in the center of the floor, with the expression of a person who had already absorbed every worst-case scenario and was now simply choosing between them. She listened to Conrad's recommendation, then turned and asked the floor supervisor if there was anyone who thought the line could be brought back online before the customer's deadline. The supervisor looked at Elias. Arabella looked at Elias. Conrad told her the man had no credentials. Arabella told Elias he had 6 hours and that if anything went wrong, the liability would fall entirely on him. She said it without cruelty but without softness, because at that point she was operating on mathematics rather than instinct. Elias accepted the terms. When he opened the primary control cabinet, he found something that stopped him for 3 full seconds, not because it confused him, but because it confirmed that the failure had not been accidental at all. A safety interlock component, a small ceramic relay that should have been standard fitted and impossible to remove without tools, had been deliberately extracted from its housing. Elias did not say anything about what he had found to the men working beside him, because the clock on the wall above the press line showed 5 hours and 41 minutes remaining, and there was no time for the conversation that discovery deserved. He understood with the particular clarity that comes to people under genuine pressure that identifying sabotage and proving it were 2 different problems, and that the second one could wait while the first one burned. What the line needed immediately was a functioning control bridge, something that would allow the 3 aging modules to communicate with each other through a pathway that did not depend on the missing relay or the proprietary software that no one at the plant had authorization to modify. Elias had been building exactly that for 4 years in the garage, behind his house in the Belhaven suburbs, working evenings and weekends on a modular coordination prototype he had documented carefully in a series of locked notebooks. He sent Calvin Brooks to retrieve 2 specific crates from the maintenance storage bay, salvage components from machines that had been decommissioned years earlier and were scheduled for scrap. And while Calvin navigated the dark far end of the facility, Elias began disassembling the secondary control interface with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the procedure in his mind more often than he could count. The assembled prototype he installed in its place was not elegant in the way that certified industrial equipment is elegant. It had exposed wiring, handwritten labels on several of its connection points, and a power routing sequence that would have puzzled any technician trained exclusively on manufacturer specifications. But it did exactly what it was designed to do. Arabella watched from the elevated control room, and something shifted in her attention when she noticed that Elias did not check a manual or consult a schematic at any point, that he moved through the machine's architecture the way a surgeon moves through anatomy, with a certainty that comes not from training alone, but from years of sustained attention to something most people had stopped listening to. Conrad Blackwell spent the next 3 hours creating friction. He contacted the plant's insurance liaison at midnight and suggested the line should be shut down pending review of the unauthorized modification and he twice had the parts storage room locked under the pretext of an inventory audit. Calvin used his supervisor override to reopen it both times. At one point, Conrad appeared on the floor and told two of the night crew that they were exposing themselves to disciplinary action by assisting Elias. And both men looked at the clock, then looked at Elias, and went back to work. The opposition was not subtle, but it was not effective either, because the people on the floor that night had not built their careers around Conrad Blackwell. They had built them around the machines, and the machines were responding. At 4:17 in the morning, the press line shuddered back to life with a resonance completely different from the grinding failure of hours earlier, a deep, even hum that every experienced hand on the floor recognized as the sound of something running the way it was supposed to run. The prototype batch completed at 5:52, 11 minutes ahead of the customer's 6-hour window, meeting every tolerance specification on the sheet. The customer's inspection team confirmed the results and authorized the full $180 million contract. The bank agreed to extend the company's credit line. 800 workers, most of whom would never know how close the edge had been, would come back to the same jobs the next morning. Arabella walked to where Elias was standing at the end of the line, wiping his hands with the deliberateness of someone who had just finished something real, and she shook his hand in front of the entire floor and said Whitmore Industrial would not forget what he had done that night. Elias thanked her professionally and then, before she turned away, asked her to have someone examine the control cabinet he had opened at the beginning of the night. He described what he had found without accusing anyone, only asking her to look. Arabella said she would. In the maintenance corridor behind the press floor, Conrad Blackwell pulled a small data device from Elias's equipment bag, which had been left unattended during the celebration, and walked quietly toward the executive parking level. The summons came at 8:15 the following morning, delivered by text, while Elias was driving his daughter Wren to school. The message said to report to the executive conference room on the 5th floor at 9 o'clock, which he recognized as unusual because people in his position were typically called to the floor manager's office, not to the floors where the carpet changed texture and the windows faced the river rather than the parking lot. He arrived to find Arabella Whitmore at the head of a long table flanked by two lawyers and Conrad Blackwell, who had arranged himself with the ease of someone who had spent the morning preparing exactly this. The charges Conrad laid out were methodical and rehearsed. Elias had installed unauthorized equipment in a certified production line without completing the required documentation, had falsified the maintenance log to obscure the modification, and had exposed the company to regulatory liability that could invalidate the very contract the night's work had secured. Beyond that, Conrad produced a document, a dated internal report, suggesting that Elias had been aware of the control module degradation for weeks and had deliberately withheld the information, positioning himself to appear indispensable at the moment of crisis. The final point, delivered with the casual certainty of someone who had verified the legal language, was that the modular coordination device Elias had installed had been developed on company time using company resources, and therefore the intellectual property belonged to Whitmore Industrial, not to the man who had designed it. Elias addressed each point with the flat accuracy of someone who had nothing to hide and therefore no reason to rush. He explained that the prototype had been built over 4 years at his own expense in his own garage, predating his employment contract by at least 30 months. He noted that his written proposals to upgrade the control architecture had been submitted 3 times to Conrad's office and never forwarded to management. He asked the lawyers to explain on what legal theory a company could claim ownership of intellectual property developed entirely off-premises without any company resources. Arabella felt the imbalance in the room, The way a story with that many internal contradictions usually contains something that has not been said yet. But outside those windows, Ashbourne Equity's legal team had sent a letter that morning warning that continued use of any uncertified technology could constitute grounds for withdrawal from a private lending facility that kept the company's operations funded. The letter had arrived at 7 in the morning. The meeting had been scheduled at 8. Arabella was precise enough to understand what that timing meant and practical enough to know that precision did not always produce justice. She signed the termination document. The stated reason was serious violation of operational protocol. Elias sat for a long moment and then asked her directly whether she genuinely believed he had endangered a plant he had just spent the night saving. She did not answer the question. She said instead that a chief executive could not run a company on instinct. Elias pushed back his chair and set his access card on the table with the deliberate care of someone returning something that had never quite belonged. And he said quietly that Conrad Blackwell was not trying to save Whitmore Industrial. He was trying to weaken it enough to sell. He said it without anger, as a statement of fact addressed to someone he still believed was intelligent enough to hear it. The walk through the production floor was the longest 200 feet of his professional life, not because of the distance, but because every worker he passed had been there the night before and now stood at their stations with the stillness of people who had calculated the cost of speaking and found it too high. Only Calvin Brooks, stationed at the far end near the shift clock, removed his hard hat and held it at his side. A gesture so small it was almost invisible and so deliberate it could not be mistaken for anything else. At the main gate, Elias turned once and looked back at the Whitmore name mounted in steel above the building's entrance and said, to no one within obvious earshot, that she had just kept the machine while sending away the only person who understood why it was still running. That evening, Conrad Blackwell filed a provisional patent application for a modular harmonic coordination system, listing Whitmore Industrial as the sole inventor. The professional consequences arrived quietly. Within 3 weeks, 4 local manufacturers who had expressed interest in hiring Elias went silent or found reasons to move forward with other candidates, and a recruiter from a Toledo equipment firm told him obliquely that someone had flagged his file as a liability risk. His savings represented approximately 5 months of household expenses at careful management. Wren asked him once at dinner whether he was going to call the company and apologize so he could go back to work. Elias set his fork down, thought about it with the seriousness she deserved, and told her that a person could apologize for something they had done wrong, but that apologizing for something they had not done was a different kind of surrender, the kind that followed you into every room for the rest of your life. He spent several evenings going through the contents of a storage shelf in his garage, which held 6 years of design notebooks, material receipts, dated photographs of prototype stages, and 3 short videos taken on his phone during testing runs in the driveway, the earliest time-stamped 41 months before his employment at Whitmore had begun. The documentation was not assembled as evidence. He had kept it only because he kept everything, but it formed a clear and sequential record of an idea that had been his before the company had ever heard of it. He brought the box to Marin Caldwell, a former Whitmore attorney who had left the company 8 months earlier and operated a small private practice on Grant Street. Marin reviewed the materials across 2 evenings and told him that a direct legal challenge to the patent application would take years and cost more than he currently possessed, but that the documentation made his original ownership essentially unambiguous to anyone willing to look at it honestly. She said the more interesting question was not whether he could recover the technology in a courtroom, but whether he could build something with it before the courtroom became necessary. Elias signed a month-to-month lease on an abandoned machining workshop at the industrial edge of Belhaven, a squat, low-ceilinged building that had last been used to fabricate agricultural equipment and still smelled of cutting oil and cold concrete. He registered the company as Rowan Forge Systems, a name that took him 3 minutes to settle on and that he did not subsequently second-guess. He hired 3 people in the first month, a master electrician named Patricia, who had been laid off from Whitmore in a previous round of cuts, a CNC programmer named Darnell, who had been doing contract work at half his usual rate, and a procurement specialist named Yvonne, who understood which suppliers would extend credit to an unknown startup with a serious founder and which would not. Calvin remained at Whitmore for the time being, but he appeared at the workshop on 2 successive Saturdays and brought 2 other displaced workers who asked quietly whether there was anything they could do that might eventually become permanent. Elias told everyone who joined that Rowan Forge would not acquire customers through competitive intelligence gathered from Whitmore, would not approach Whitmore's suppliers to undercut existing relationships, and would not recruit actively from the current workforce. The company would compete on what it could build, not on what it could take. One early investor offered a capital injection that would have accelerated the prototype work significantly. The offer was contingent on the investor receiving operational control of key decisions within the first 18 months. Elias declined. He had spent 16 years building something for someone else, and he was not willing to sign the same arrangement under different letterhead. The first viable prototype ran at full specification on the 43rd day of operation, reducing energy draw in a contracted test environment by nearly 30% compared with the existing system it replaced. Rowan Forge's first paying customer was a precision parts manufacturer in a town called Drover, 40 miles east of Belhaven, which had been manufacturing suspension components for regional equipment dealers for over 30 years and had been turned away by Whitmore Industrial 18 months earlier because its order volume was considered too small to justify the account. The owner, a man named Earl Hargrove, called Elias after reading a brief item in a regional industry newsletter, and when Elias drove out to Drover and walked the floor of Hargrove's facility, he spent 40 minutes asking questions about the machinery before he mentioned what his system could do. Hargrove signed a service agreement by the end of the week. The results were measurable within 60 days, and Hargrove mentioned them to 2 other small manufacturers he knew personally, both of whom had similar situations. Functional plants running inefficient lines that the major service providers had determined were not worth their attention. The model Rowan Forge built was not based on replacing what existed, but on extracting what remained. Elias did not tell customers their equipment was obsolete. He told them what it was still capable of and helped them reach it. This approach spread across the small to mid-size manufacturing sector of Central Ohio faster than a marketing campaign would have, because it was transmitted person to person by people who had no reason to exaggerate. Within 6 months, Rowan Forge had service contracts with 9 facilities, employed 14 people full-time, and had generated enough consistent revenue that Marin was able to file a formal challenge to Whitmore's patent application with supporting documentation that a patent examiner would find difficult to dismiss without visible bad faith. Whitmore Industrial, in the same period, was experiencing the particular degradation of a system whose designer had been removed from it. The harmonic sequencing installation Elias had built during the crisis night held together for approximately 4 months before the absence of his ongoing calibration began to show in the data. Multiple engineering consultants reviewed the system and produced conflicting assessments. None of them could reconstruct the logic of the modular routing from the documentation available, because the documentation reflected what the system looked like from the outside and not the reasoning that had produced it. Throughput dropped, maintenance costs rose, and Arabella requested briefings and received them without anyone being able to tell her what to actually do. Conrad Blackwell told the board that the instability was a consequence of flawed original design, a characterization that was both convenient and untrue. The story broke into public visibility when a local journalist named Sylvia Park wrote a piece for the Belhaven Courier titled, "Laid Off Machinist is Quietly Rebuilding What Industry Left Behind," which ran on a Thursday afternoon and was shared widely enough that by Friday morning 3 other regional publications had picked up the story. Arabella read it at her desk and recognized details that only someone with direct familiarity with both companies could have noticed. The article accused no one. It did not need to, because the comparison existed in the facts themselves, and the facts were reported accurately. She put it down and told herself, without quite believing it, that Rowan Forge's growth was temporary. What actually happened was that Northline Components, a mid-sized manufacturer that had maintained a supply contract with Whitmore for 11 years, announced it was transferring its primary maintenance agreement to Rowan Forge after a trial engagement produced results its own engineers described in an internal memo as significantly beyond what had been considered achievable. Within the same week, an invitation arrived at Rowan Forge's workshop address on printed federal letterhead, a request to participate in the final bidding round for a national infrastructure project designated Atlas, valued at $400 million, covering motor systems for a rail transit network operating across the country. Whitmore Industrial was also on the list. Project Atlas was the kind of contract that appeared once in a generation. Not because of its size alone, but because of what winning it meant for the company that did. Federal certification, national visibility, and anchor revenue that permitted serious long-term planning. The specifications required a coordinated motor system capable of handling variable load profiles across hundreds of installations with minimal maintenance, optimized for energy efficiency at scale, and backed by a company with demonstrated manufacturing capacity. Whitmore Industrial had 3 of those 4 attributes. Rowan Forge had the 4th. Arabella understood this before she finished reading the preliminary brief, and the understanding produced in her a discomfort she did not immediately allow herself to name. The presentations were scheduled over 2 days at a federal facilities office in Columbus. Elias arrived with Darnell and Marin and a presentation deck that prioritized data over narrative because he had spent enough time on floors where the decision-makers were engineers to understand that engineers responded to evidence rather than salesmanship. He wore a gray suit he had purchased specifically for the occasion and carried himself with the composure of a man who was exactly where his preparation had put him. He addressed Arabella once during the question session following Rowan Forge's technical presentation, not by first name but as Mrs. Whitmore, and the shift in register was so deliberate and so precisely calibrated that several people in the room who had no knowledge of their history still noticed it. Arabella answered the procedural question with professional accuracy and later described the interaction to no one. Conrad Blackwell reached Elias by phone 2 hours after the first day of presentations ended and made an offer, a number real enough to retire Elias's remaining debt, fund Wren's education, and leave a balance that represented genuine financial security by any reasonable measure. The condition was that Elias transfer ownership of Rowan Forge to a holding structure that Conrad did not name, but that Elias recognized as consistent with Ashbourne Equity's acquisition pattern. Elias told Conrad the company was not for sale, that it had not been built to be sold, and that he would not spend the next chapter of his working life answering to the same interests that had twice tried to extract value from workers while offering them nothing in return. Arabella requested a private meeting with Elias on the evening between the two presentation days and told him that Whitmore was not his enemy and that a competitive market was healthier for both companies than a prolonged conflict. Elias acknowledged the point and agreed with it. He also told her that two companies competing in a legitimate market was exactly what healthy industry looked like, and that since she had taught him directly that business did not operate on sentiment, she would understand that he intended to win the contract on the merits of his technology, and that he expected her to attempt the same. Arabella was left with her own logic in her hands like something she had not expected to be handed back. That night, the performance data in Rowan Forge's submitted technical documentation was altered. Specific efficiency figures were changed to values that suggested instability under high-load conditions, and two safety compliance entries were modified to show pending status, where confirmed status had previously been recorded. The access log on the Federal Procurement Portal showed the modification had occurred at 2:14 in the morning. The originating server address resolved to a machine registered to Whitmore Industrial's information technology infrastructure. Elias discovered the discrepancy the following morning when Darnell cross-referenced the submitted file against their working copy and found 17 fields that did not match. The differences were not random errors. They were targeted changes to precisely the values that a technical panel would weight most heavily when assessing risk, and the pattern of the modification suggested someone who understood the evaluation criteria well enough to know which numbers would cause the most damage without triggering an obvious forgery flag. Elias took the documentation to Marin before the second presentation session began. He then presented from the unmodified copy, corrected the record calmly before the panel by submitting a secondary version with a notarized timestamp, and described the discrepancy as a file integrity issue that had been identified and resolved. He made no public accusation. The panel noted the amended submission and proceeded. Marin, working from her hotel room that afternoon, traced the access log backward through 3 routing nodes and confirmed that the modification had originated from a device registered to a Whitmore Industrial account, and that the digital authorization token attached to the file access carried a signature matching Conrad Blackwell's administrative credentials. The more complicated discovery came alongside it. The same account had been used 8 months earlier to alter the timestamps on the patent application documents, backdating them to suggest the system had been developed inside Whitmore's facilities during working hours. She also located, in a directory that Conrad had apparently not known was visible to a former internal attorney with the right credentials, a communication thread with a contact connected to Ashbourne Equity. The thread documented a deliberate plan to induce a production crisis at Whitmore during a critical contract window, force a management deadlock, and use the resulting instability to justify an emergency acquisition. The component Elias had found missing from the control cabinet on the night of the crisis had not been removed by accident or by gradual deterioration. It had been removed by design. Arabella received the internal engineering report from a technician named Barrett, who had been part of the original maintenance team and who had carried the weight of what he knew for the better part of a year and could no longer carry it quietly. The report confirmed what Elias had told her that morning in the production facility before the security guard arrived. The interlock component had been removed manually, with tools, in the 72-hour window before the prototype run, authorized by a work order bearing Conrad's signature. She had promoted Conrad, relied on Conrad, and fired the man who had understood what Conrad was doing before she had been willing to listen. She went through the patent filing with a precision she had not applied to it in the weeks following the termination and found what the documents showed when you looked at them as documentation rather than as confirmation of a decision already made. Altered dates, a description of a device that matched Elias's design across dozens of technical parameters, and a cover sheet listing Whitmore Industrial as the inventor of a system it had taken from the man it had walked to the gate. She confronted Conrad in his office. He did not deny the substance and instead reminded her that her signature appeared on the termination order, on the patent filing acknowledgement, and on the letter submitted with Whitmore's application, and that if the full record became visible, her position would be difficult to defend regardless of who had orchestrated it. He offered a resolution: facilitate the Ashbourne acquisition quietly, accept a structured exit, and the documentation would remain contained. Arabella told him she would think about it, then drove to the east side of Belhaven that evening and knocked on the door of a building where the lights were still on at 10 o'clock. She told Elias she was sorry, said it without qualifying language, without contextual framing, without the word but. Elias let the silence rest for a moment and said that the apology mattered and that it could not return the professional standing that had been taken from him in a single morning, but that it was the first honest thing he had heard from the company's leadership since the night she told him he had 6 hours and meant it. He took the full documentation she had brought. Marin, reviewing the materials that same night, confirmed they were sufficient to file simultaneously with the Federal Procurement Inspector's Office, the State Corporate Fraud Division, and the Whitmore Board of Directors. The final Atlas presentation was scheduled for a Thursday at 10 in the morning, which was also the Thursday that Whitmore Industrial's primary lending facility would require a payment the company could not make in full without drawing on a reserve the board had 3 times declared off-limits. Conrad had structured the timing precisely. If Atlas went to Whitmore, the cash flow would stabilize the situation. If it did not, the company would be insolvent before the next board meeting, at which point Ashbourne would move in as a distressed buyer with an offer already prepared. Elias spent the evening before the final presentation considering the simplest available path. Conrad's misconduct presented publicly that morning would almost certainly trigger an emergency investigation that would freeze the Atlas decision for weeks, during which Whitmore's financial situation would reach a point of no return. Rowan Forge would be the only remaining qualified bidder. The contract would arrive not as a competitive victory, but as a consequence of collapse, and 800 people would lose jobs that had survived only because of what Elias had done on a February night that the company had subsequently decided to punish him for. He separated the two problems with the same discipline he applied to machinery when multiple systems were failing simultaneously. Address each fault at its actual location rather than treating the whole assembly as unsalvageable. He submitted the evidentiary package simultaneously to the Federal Procurement Inspector's Office, the Ohio Corporate Fraud Division, and the Whitmore Board of Directors, with a cover note from Marin establishing the documentation chain and requesting that the Atlas evaluation proceed on its technical merits without delay. He then presented Rowan Forge's final submission on schedule, beginning at 10, using only the performance data his team had generated and making no reference to any other company's internal affairs. The technical presentation ran for 55 minutes and produced the longest sustained question session the panel conducted across any of the competing submissions. Arabella appeared before Whitmore's board at 2 in the afternoon and told them what she knew. All of it, including the parts where her own decisions had been wrong. She did not characterize herself as deceived. She said she had made choices that prioritized institutional protection over factual investigation, and that the company was now in the situation those choices had produced. Conrad was suspended pending investigation before the end of the business day. A forensic review of the bank reporting confirmed fabricated figures within 48 hours, and the default notice was withdrawn. Dominic Ashbourne's acquisition filing was withdrawn 48 hours after that, when it became clear that the acquisition's legal architecture depended on a default that was no longer occurring and a management team that no longer existed in the form he had been dealing with. The Atlas Technical Panel announced its recommendation on a Monday. Rowan Forge Systems was the preferred technology provider. The panel simultaneously noted that Rowan Forge's declared production capacity was insufficient to fulfill the contract at the required scale without a manufacturing partnership confirmed within 30 days. Elias read the announcement sitting at his desk in the workshop on the east side of Belhaven and sat with it for a long time. The only facility in the region with the right equipment configuration, the right workforce, and the physical space to absorb the Atlas production volume was the 40-acre plant on the south side of town, whose name was written in steel above the front entrance. Arabella's call came the same afternoon, direct to Elias's cell phone, and she made the offer without preamble. Whitmore would make its production capacity available to Rowan Forge under a manufacturing services agreement, allowing Rowan Forge to fulfill the Atlas contract while keeping full ownership of the technology. The board had discussed returning Elias to the company in a senior technical role. She wanted him to know that option was on the table if he wanted it. He told her it was not an option he wanted. He sent her the term sheet Marin had drafted the following morning. The structure was uncomplicated. Rowan Forge would retain complete ownership of all technology developed by its team, with no claim by Whitmore on future derivative designs. Whitmore would manufacture under contract at market rates, with the Atlas production schedule as the anchor engagement. Workers who had been cut from Whitmore's payroll in the preceding 18 months would receive priority consideration for any open positions on the Atlas line. Arabella would issue a public statement correcting the stated grounds for Elias's termination and restoring his professional record. All patents and inventions created by Whitmore's workforce going forward would be credited transparently to the individuals who created them. If Arabella declined, Elias had identified a manufacturing facility in Canton willing to discuss a lease arrangement, though the timeline for Atlas would be tighter than the panel preferred. The risk of losing the contract entirely was real. He stated this plainly in a covering note, then did not follow up. The Whitmore board met for 3 hours and produced a counterproposal that adjusted the manufacturing rate formula and requested a 5-year exclusivity clause on Atlas-related production. Elias declined the exclusivity clause without drama and the rate adjustment without further negotiation. Arabella signed the original term sheet. She told the board that the company was not diminished by the agreement. They were simply paying a price that their own choices had set, and the price was fair. On the morning Elias returned to the plant, he drove through the main entrance for the first time since the security guard had walked him in the opposite direction and parked in the visitor lot rather than the employee lot, which was a small distinction that everyone in the building understood. The workers on the Atlas production line were assembled in the main floor corridor by the time he reached it, not by any instruction, but by the organic coordination that happens in workplaces when people understand that a moment is significant. Arabella stood at the front of the assembled plant and said, without a prepared statement, that she had made a decision 16 months earlier that was wrong, that the error had not been forced on her, and that she was responsible for it. She did not say she had been misled, though she had been. She did not distribute the blame, though it was distributable. Several workers who had been present on the night of the crisis stood quietly in the back and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Elias shook her hand in front of the assembled plant and said they had 30 days to prove that two organizations with a legitimate reason to distrust each other could build something better than either could build alone, and that the only way to prove it was to start. 3 days into preparation, a technician on the main press floor flagged an anomalous vibration in the primary drive assembly. The same slow-building resonance that Elias had first heard 16 months ago, when the machine had been trying to tell someone who was paying attention that something had been taken from it. The vibration was not a second act of sabotage. The forensic review confirmed that within 2 hours, it was something more straightforward and in some ways more honest. The accumulated consequence of a system run without full understanding for over a year, calibrated by technicians working from incomplete documentation and good intentions. The modular routing Elias had installed during the crisis night had been designed with a self-correction mechanism requiring periodic manual override sequences to prevent harmonic buildup. Without those overrides, which only Elias had known to perform, the pressure had been accumulating for months. The underlying design was robust enough to absorb the neglect longer than any conventional system would have, but it had reached a threshold. Shutting down the line to perform a full recalibration would take a minimum of 4 days, which the Atlas timeline did not allow. Running the line without addressing the vibration risked producing components that failed quality inspection, which would cost more time than the shutdown and damage the contract relationship before it had properly begun. Arabella appeared on the floor rather than calling a meeting, which Elias registered but did not remark on. She told him she was not going to make a unilateral decision about the technical path forward, that the equipment was operating under his design philosophy, and that the decision and its consequences belonged to the person with the best understanding of the system. She said she would stand in front of the board and account for whatever outcome resulted. Elias assembled a working group that included Patricia, Darnell, 3 of Whitmore's most experienced line technicians, and Calvin Brooks, who had joined the Rowan Forge team officially the week the partnership agreement was signed. They worked through the night on a solution that none of them had individually designed, a staged recalibration procedure that could be performed on a running line by distributing the override sequences across separate machine zones, eliminating the buildup without interrupting production flow. The procedure had never been tested at scale. Elias explained this clearly to everyone in the room and asked each person whether they were willing to proceed on the basis of analysis rather than precedent. Every person in the room said yes without requiring time to consider it, which was the answer he had expected from people who had spent their careers trusting the evidence in front of them rather than waiting for someone with a title to confirm what they already knew. The Atlas production run delivered its first completed batch 11 days into the schedule, 3 days ahead of the adjusted timeline, with every component clearing quality inspection at the first pass. The Belhaven region's manufacturing employment rate, which had been declining steadily for 4 years, dropped in the other direction for the first time in that period when the Atlas line reached full staffing. At the opening of Rowan Forge's expanded facility 14 months later, a building twice the size of the original workshop on the same east side block, with a sign above the entrance in a font Wren had chosen, Elias gave a short speech that lasted less than 4 minutes. He said the company had been built by people who had been told they were not necessary and that the only real answer to that kind of dismissal was work that proved otherwise. He said the name on the building belonged to everyone who had decided to believe in something before there was evidence the belief would pay off. Arabella attended and stood at the edge of the gathering rather than near the front. After the crowd thinned, she found Elias by the entrance and asked whether he still thought of her as a competitor. He said that the kind of competitor worth worrying about was one who wanted to take everything from you, and that he had never wanted to take anything from her, only to make certain that the people keeping machines running were never again the first ones walked to the gate. She said she wanted to have dinner, not to discuss contracts. He considered it with the deliberateness he applied to every question that actually mattered, then said yes, on the condition that neither of them mentioned work. They left together as the last light crossed the roofline of the new building, two names in the same industry walking away from the place where an idea had been stolen, recovered, and turned into something neither of them could have built alone. Not the owner and the worker anymore, but two people standing on the same ground with the same machines humming steadily behind them that had started everything.